Where the fighting was thickest, the stakes were highest, and the consequences most immediate. Hoster Tully staunchly held River Run, the ancient castle strategically perched at the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone River. It was the natural seat of Riverland's power, well-positioned, well-supplied, and fortified enough to withstand a prolonged siege. It did not fall into enemy hands, but merely holding the castle was a far cry from controlling the region, and the surrounding land bled profusely under the relentless pressure of war. The towns and crossings along the rivers became scenes of brutal fighting, episodes often overlooked by the grand histories, which tended to focus on the more celebrated and decisive battles that shaped the narrative
This is a travesty of justice!
Knights and levies, bowmen and rivermen clashed fiercely over bridges and fords and over the narrow stretches of road that served as lifelines for supply movement, where vital resources could be delivered or intercepted with devastating effect. This was not a war of gallant single combats and famous banners, the kind that would later be romanticized in songs and embellished in tales. It was a war of attrition, a relentless grinding down of resources and morale. Was the unglamorous, grueling work of denying the enemy movement, disrupting their supply lines, and maintaining one's own precarious position in a landscape scarred by conflict. As Ned Stark's forces marched south, they passed through or near contested Riverlands territory, and their strict discipline proved invaluable in maintaining the tenuous peace with the local populace. The northern host did not pillage or plunder, an all too common practice among armies in times of war. Ned had issued clear and unequivocal instructions on this point, and his bannermen, bound by personal loyalty to him and understanding the strategic importance of maintaining good relations with the local population, scrupulously respected his orders. The Northmen understood that making enemies of the very people whose roads they were marching on was a recipe for disaster, inviting constant harassment and cutting off vital supplies. They moved through villages and left them standing, the thatched roofs and timber walls untouched by the flames of war. They bought provisions whenever possible, paying fairly for what they needed rather than seizing them by force, earning goodwill and ensuring a steady flow of supplies. The sharp contrast between their conduct and that of some of the other forces moving through the region was duly noted at the time by those who kept records, solidifying Ned's reputation for honor and fairness. The Loyalist commanders in the Riverlands were not without their strengths. The Crown had dispatched capable men to the field, individuals who possessed a deep understanding of the terrain and skillfully used it to make the rebel advance far more costly than it might otherwise have been. Every ford that had to be forced, every ambush that thinned a column of soldiers, every supply wagon that was intercepted, added to the cumulative toll that the war was exacting on the rebel alliance's already strained resources and dwindling patience. But the Riverlands, despite the valiant efforts of its defenders, could not indefinitely withstand the overwhelming weight of the forces moving through them. The rebel forces were simply too numerous, too well-motivated, and too competently led for the Loyalist presence in the region to do more than significantly slow their relentless advance. Slow it they did, buying precious time for the Crown. The men who fought there on both sides, mired in the mud and drenched by the constant rain along the river roads, paid the full and terrible price for a conflict whose origins lay elsewhere, in the intrigues and ambitions of the great houses, and whose ultimate resolution would occur somewhere else entirely, on a more decisive battlefield. While the Riverlands burned, its fields trampled, and its villages ravaged, and while the main rebel host relentlessly pushed south toward the fateful encounter at the Trident, a different kind of war was being waged on the southern coast, a war of attrition and endurance. Storm's End, the ancient seat of House Baratheon, a castle of legendary construction and formidable strength, stood as a bastion of rebel resistance against the encroaching forces of the Crown. Its imposing drum tower, according to legend,
won't get away with this!
Duran Godsgrief himself,
the people rise against!
No storm wind could find a corner to grip, ensuring its timeless resilience. It had stood for thousands of years, weathering storms that had leveled lesser fortresses to rubble. It had never fallen to siege, and it would not fall in this war either. Robert Baratheon, the charismatic leader of the rebellion, was not present to personally oversee the defense of his ancestral home. He was in the field, leading his forces north and west, fighting the decisive battles that would determine the rebellion's military progress. The crucial task of holding Storm's End, the symbolic heart of Baratheon power, was entrusted to his younger brother, Stannis. Stannis was not yet 20 years old, a young man of unyielding determination. He had not yet distinguished himself in any prior conflict, as no prior conflict had afforded him the opportunity to prove his mettle. He was not celebrated for his charm or charisma, nor was he beloved by the common folk. He was, according to the accounts of those who knew him in those years, a stern and unyielding young man of few words and rigid principle, entirely disinclined toward the theatrical displays of courage and bravado that often made men famous. Yet he was precisely the kind of man who could hold a castle that everyone expected to fall, a man of unwavering resolve and uncompromising duty. The Tyrell host, a formidable force from the Reach, arrived outside the imposing walls of Storm's End with numbers that should have made the outcome of the siege appear inevitable. Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden and commander of the Reach's armies, led a vast and well-provisioned force, the largest single loyalist host in the south. They established their camps, strategically positioned their siege engines, and settled in to wait, confident that time and hunger would inevitably break the rebel garrison. Stone walls could hold against the sea and the elements, but they could not be eaten when the grain ran out, turning the castle into a prison. Stannis, ever meticulous and pragmatic, immediately counted his provisions and assessed his men, and promptly initiated a system of strict rationing. What followed was nearly a year of genuine privation and hardship inside those ancient walls, a trial that tested the very limits of human endurance. The garrison and the castle's inhabitants lived on less than they needed, then on progressively less than that, their hunger gnawing at their bellies and testing their resolve. The accounts that survived from that grim period describe conditions that steadily deteriorated, moving from mere discomfort to severe hardship, and finally reaching a point that pushed the inhabitants to the very edge of survival. This was not simply a matter of discomfort for the soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend the castle, but also for the servants, cooks, and other non-combatants within the walls who had never asked to be participants in a brutal siege. Yet Stannis did not break. That is not to say that the garrison did not suffer, for they suffered considerably under the relentless siege, but Stannis held the discipline of the castle together, enforcing his will and inspiring unwavering loyalty through the sheer force of his own uncompromising refusal to consider any alternative to victory. He would not negotiate surrender, even as supplies dwindled and hunger gnawed at his men. He would not send messages to Mace Tyrell indicating any softening of resolve, any hint of desperation. He maintained an exterior of unwavering certainty and unbreakable resolve, regardless of the grim reality within the castle walls. He understood, with the practical intelligence of a young man who had studied the art of siege warfare, that the moment the besieging force believed that their target was close to breaking, their resolve would stiffen and their attacks would intensify, while the defenders' morale would be fatally undermined. The garrison was kept alive in the final desperate months of the siege by a daring smuggler named Davos Seaworth, a man of common birth and no noble house to claim. He navigated a small, swift boat through the Tyrell blockade under the cover of darkness. His hold, laden with onions and saltfish, was enough, barely enough, to keep the garrison from starvation. Not enough for comfort or sustenance, but enough for survival. When the war finally ended and Storm's End was relieved, Stannis rewarded Davos for his extraordinary bravery and invaluable service with a knighthood, raising him from obscurity to a position of honor. But Stannis, ever the pragmatist and unflinching enforcer of justice, also famously had the smuggler's fingers shortened, one from each hand down to the knuckle, as punishment for the crimes Davos had committed before entering his service, when he had made his living by illicit means. Stannis firmly believed that both the reward and the punishment were equally required, a testament to his rigid adherence to his personal code of honor. He was that kind of man. The siege never broke Storm's End from the outside. What ultimately ended the siege was the arrival of Eddard Stark with the rebel host after the decisive battle at the Trident, after King's Landing had fallen to the Lannister armies and the war was already irrevocably decided. The Tyrell army, their cause lost, stood down and lifted the siege, opening the gates of Storm's End. Stannis walked out of the castle he had so stubbornly held for the better part of a year into a world that had already moved on without him. He received little recognition for his extraordinary feat of endurance. Stannis was given Dragonstone, a strategically important but somewhat desolate island, rather than being restored to Storm's End, his rightful inheritance. Renly, his younger brother who had contributed nothing of significance to the war effort, eventually received the seat that Stannis had bled and suffered to hold, a deep and lasting injustice. The gratitude Stannis believed he had so richly earned never materialized in the form he expected, and that absence, that perceived slight, would profoundly shape everything he did in the years that followed, fueling his ambition, sharpening his sense of grievance, and driving him to pursue his perceived destiny with relentless determination. The Ruby Ford on the Trident River, a crossing wide enough to ford and strategically important enough to hold, became, in the year 283 AC, the battlefield where the fate of the Targaryen dynasty was irrevocably determined. The royal forces, desperate to stem the tide of rebellion, were commanded by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen himself. It is worth pausing to consider that Rhaegar had not been the central military figure of the war's early phase. His father's council had dispatched other commanders, some of whom had performed adequately, while others had failed spectacularly to contest the relentless rebel advance. The loyalist cause had not been entirely without its victories, but neither had it achieved the decisive blow that could shift the war's momentum and reverse the fortunes of the crown. Rhaegar had been conspicuously absent from that early fighting, and the nature of his absence had generated its own swirling cloud of speculation and rumor among the rebel lords. The question of his whereabouts had its answer in the whispers of Lyanna Stark in a tower in Dorne, a place sheltered from the brutal consequences of the war that his actions had ignited. The precise nature of his sojourn there, whether it was the seclusion of a man consumed by prophecy or the retreat of a man who understood that he had committed an irreparable act and was not yet ready to face the devastating repercussions, is one of those lingering questions that the available evidence does not fully and definitively answer. According to all surviving accounts, when Rhaegar finally emerged from his self-imposed exile and rode north to take command of the royal forces, something about him had fundamentally changed, or perhaps merely resolved itself into a new and hardened form. Those who saw him in those final days before the battle described a man of peculiar stillness and quiet intensity, not the stillness of defeat or despair, but something closer to a somber acceptance. He possessed the quality of a person who had made a profound decision that, whatever was coming, he would meet it head-on, with unwavering courage and a fatalistic resolve. He had cause for profound calculation and ample reason for soul-crushing dread, and he may have carried both in equal measure, carefully balancing the hopes and fears that weighed upon his heart. The rebel army that faced him across the Trident was significantly stronger than the disparate forces that had first taken to the field in the war's early months. The recruitment of new men, the arrival of fresh reinforcements from the Vale, and the contributions of northern lords who had traversed the longer, more arduous road south had swelled the rebel ranks and bolstered their fighting capacity. More importantly, the rebel forces were fueled by the unwavering morale of an army that had been consistently winning, achieving victory after victory against the odds, not without suffering losses and not without weathering difficult and perilous moments, but winning broadly, relentlessly moving forward, seizing ground and holding it with unwavering determination. Rhaegar, despite the size of his army, faced fewer advantages than the numbers might have suggested. His men were fighting for a king who inspired no personal loyalty, a king whose madness had alienated many of his subjects. They were fighting for a prince who had initiated a war by making a choice that even his own supporters found difficult to defend, a choice that had shattered the stability of the realm, and they were fighting against men who had genuine grievances and burning anger, a potent and motivating force that is always harder to stand against than the indifferent courage of soldiers merely following orders. The battle itself was fierce and chaotic, as battles involving large forces on open ground tend to be. It was costly in terms of lives lost and ultimately resolved less by any single brilliant stroke of military genius than by the accumulated weight of 1,000 individual encounters, small acts of bravery and desperation that slowly shifted the balance of power. Men fell on both sides, their blood staining the waters of the Trident. Standards went down, only to be raised again by other hands, as determined soldiers rallied to the call of their leaders. The deafening noise, the swirling dust, and the crimson blood of it filled the ford and soaked the banks on either side, transforming the once pristine river into a scene of carnage and despair. And in the midst of all the chaos and carnage, the two men who embodied the war's central conflict, the two figures whose destinies were intertwined, finally came together. Robert, fueled by righteous anger and a burning desire for justice, saw Rhaegar across the battlefield and rode to meet him, seeking a final and decisive confrontation. The single combat between Robert Baratheon and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen has passed into the realm of legend, becoming the kind of story that accumulates detail over generations, each retelling adding something new, smoothing over something else, until the event is transformed into a legend that no longer quite fits the original facts. Men who are not even present at the Trident now claim to vividly remember it, while men who are actually there recall different versions of the same event, colored by their own experiences and biases. The stories have been told so many times in so many halls, by so many voices, that the surface of the event has been polished smooth, losing its original texture and shape. They met in the shallows of the river, the waters swirling around their horses' hooves. The warhammer and the sword clashed against each other in a furious exchange, their movements dictated by the swift current, the treacherous footing, and the surrounding chaos of the battlefield. Robert, who had been fighting his way toward this moment for the duration of an entire war, who had carried the specific and consuming anger of a man who believed he had been personally wronged by the man standing before him, brought to the fight something far beyond ordinary battlefield determination. He brought the full force of his righteous fury, his unwavering belief in the justice of his cause, and his burning desire to avenge the wrongs that had been committed against him and his loved ones. Rhaegar fell, his body sinking into the shallow waters of the Trident. Rubies from his armor scattered into the current as he tumbled from his saddle, catching the light for a fleeting moment before the water claimed them, dispersing them downstream like tears shed for a fallen dynasty. Fords would later be remembered as the Ruby Ford, a poignant and enduring memorial to that fateful day. Whether any rubies were actually recovered in the aftermath, or whether the name is simply a symbolic tribute attached to the death of a famous man, matters less than what the image itself captures. The crown prince of the Targaryen dynasty, sinking into the shallows of the river with his jewels floating away around him, is a true and resonant image of what that moment truly meant, even if the precise physical details resist definitive verification. Robert was badly wounded during the fierce combat, sustaining blows deep and serious enough to take him off the field and keep him from participating in the final decisive events of the war. He had, however, accomplished the essential thing that the rebellion required of him. He had killed the man the rebellion desperately needed him to kill, the heir to the throne, the prince who had sparked the conflict. But he would not be there for the end of it, his wounds denying him the satisfaction of witnessing the final triumph of his cause. The royal army, once Rhaegar fell, did not immediately collapse. Armies, especially in the heat of battle, do not always immediately grasp the full implications of their commander's death. The fighting continued, with men on both sides continuing to swing their swords, push forward, and desperately try to hold their ground, because the alternative was to turn their backs in the middle of a raging battle, which is how most men die who do not die facing forward. But the will to continue the fight had been extinguished from the Loyalist center, draining away like blood from a fatal wound. The commanders who had to make critical decisions in the hours following Rhaegar's death were making them without the one thing that had given the royal cause whatever fleeting coherence it still possessed: the charismatic leadership and unifying vision of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The rebel forces, for their part, were electrified and energized by what they had witnessed, or by what word of it had spread to say they had seen. The balance of the battle irrevocably tipped in their favor. The Loyalist forces, their morale shattered, began to withdraw, then retreated in disarray, and finally dissolved into a rout. The war was not yet over, but the question of how it would ultimately end no longer required any serious deliberation or debate. The Targaryen dynasty had but one final horrifying act remaining, and it would be performed not on any battlefield, but in the throne room of King's Landing, by a king who had decided that if the world would not willingly submit to him, he would take it down with him in a fiery conflagration. What Aerys did in the days immediately following the Battle of the Trident tells the complete and chilling story of what he had become, the depths of his madness and the extent of his depravity. He was not without information, for ravens flew swiftly between the capital and the battlefields, carrying news of both victory and defeat. Scouts returned with detailed reports of the rebel advance. Men who had survived the carnage of the Trident made their way back to King's Landing, bearing the devastating news of Rhaegar's death. Aerys knew what had happened. He understood the overall shape of events, even if the full picture took time to fully assemble, and he still had choices available to him. This is perhaps the thing most worth emphasizing about the tragic final days of Aerys Targaryen. A king in his position, despite the dire circumstances, was not entirely without choices. Rational response to the catastrophic news Even a self-interested, rational response stripped of all altruism and concerned solely with the survival of the Targaryen line would have recognized that Rhaegar was gone, but that the line itself was not entirely ended. There were still heirs to consider, potential successors who could carry on the Targaryen legacy. The queen, Rhaella, was pregnant with another child, offering a flicker of hope for the future. Young Viserys, though still a child, existed as another potential heir to the Iron Throne. The dynasty, the rebel Jon Aerys, the term, but Aerys did not negotiate. He had spent years slowly descending into madness, believing that the only answer to any perceived threat was fire, the ultimate weapon of destruction. He had spent years secretly filling the hidden places of King's Landing with the means of final destruction, with caches of wildfire that could obliterate the entire city in a green inferno. He had told himself, and perhaps truly believed, that this was true power, that having the capacity to burn everything was the same as having the capacity to survive anything, a twisted and dangerous delusion. The wildfire was his dragon, a terrifying extension of his own fiery nature. The wildfire was his birthright made manifest in green flame, a symbol of the Targaryen power he believed was his to wield without restraint. And now, with the armies of the rebels marching relentlessly toward his gates and his beloved son dead in a river stained with blood, he reached for it, embracing the madness that had long festered within him. He ordered the pyromancers, those twisted artisans of destruction, to make ready their terrible creations. The pots of wildfire were carefully distributed throughout the city, placed in strategic locations to maximize their destructive potential. The locations, painstakingly prepared over years of patient and obsessive labor, were confirmed. The caches beneath the Sept of Baelor, beneath the crowded storehouses, beneath the very streets through which the common folk of King's Landing walked every day, blissfully unaware of the horrifying doom that burned silently under their feet. All of it was primed, ready to be unleashed at his command. He reportedly paced the throne room in those final frantic days, his fingernails stained black from his constant fidgeting, his eyes burning with feverish intensity. He spoke to the pyromancers in long, rambling sessions, obsessively reviewing their preparations, testing their knowledge, and finding a perverse satisfaction in their reports of readiness. There are accounts pieced together afterward from the fragmented testimony of terrified servants who survived the carnage and the hushed whispers of conflicted guards who spoke under the veil of secrecy, that describe a man who had found, in the imminent approach of his own end, a kind of terrifying serenity, a perverse sense of peace born from the depths of his madness. He would burn, he declared with manic glee. The city would burn, consumed by the green flames of wildfire. And from that burning, from that cataclysmic destruction, he would be reborn, rising from the ashes like a phoenix, a true dragon king. This is the language he used. According to the accounts that exist, the twisted and grandiose pronouncements of a mind irrevocably broken. Reborn, he repeated, lost in his delusion. Dragons are born from fire, he reasoned, his voice echoing in the vast and empty throne room. He had the blood of the dragon in him. He had always believed this, had always felt it as a primal identity beneath all the other identities, the trappings of kingship, the bonds of son and husband and lord. And if the fire came now and consumed everything, then perhaps what would rise from it would be something the world had not seen since the last of the great beasts soared above the Blackwater Bay, something terrifying and unstoppable. It was, of course, utter madness, the product of a mind irrevocably shattered by years of paranoia and cruelty. But it was madness with a shape, an internal logic, a perverse and terrifying consistency that made it even more dangerous than simple chaos. He then sent the desperate invitation to Tywin Lannister, the powerful and cunning lord of Casterly Rock. Whether he genuinely believed that Tywin would come to his rescue and defend him after the years of accumulated insult and resentment, after the humiliating resignation from his position as Hand, after everything that had transpired between them, is one of the questions that the historical record simply cannot answer definitively. Perhaps the insidious paranoia that had consumed Aerys had by then completely severed his connection to any accurate reading of the external world, distorting his perceptions and blinding him to the true motivations of those around him. Perhaps he genuinely expected Tywin to come, interpreting the approaching Lannister forces as a sign of impending rescue, and died with that delusional expectation intact. Perhaps he saw through Tywin's elaborate charade, Recognizing the treachery that lurked beneath the surface and invited Tywin to King's Landing anyway, thinking that whatever Tywin ultimately did would simply confirm the deep-seated treachery he had always suspected, and would thereby justify the wholesale burning he was already meticulously planning. Whatever his true motivations, the invitation was sent and Tywin came marching his armies toward the capital. But he did not come to save the king, nor to defend the Targaryen dynasty. When the gates of King's Landing swung open to admit the Lannister armies, the city initially rejoiced, believing in those first confused and chaotic hours that rescue had finally arrived. They had been delivered from the threat of the approaching rebel army. They had not. Tywin's calculation was as cold and precise as everything he did, driven solely by ambition and a ruthless pursuit of power. He had watched the unfolding war from his carefully maintained position of neutrality, patiently observing the ebb and flow of the conflict, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. He had seen the devastating outcome of the battle at the Trident. He had received the desperate raven from Aerys, pleading for his aid, and he had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had spent decades thinking about power and how to acquire and wield it, that the moment to make his move had finally arrived, not to save the Targaryens from certain defeat, but to ruthlessly replace them, seizing the Iron Throne for himself and his family. The armies he marched into King's Landing wore the crimson and gold colors of House Lannister, not the black and red of House Targaryen. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and possessed a chilling sense of purpose. They moved through the city streets with a controlled efficiency of forces that had been explicitly told what to do and given no room for ambiguity or hesitation. The sacking that followed was carefully controlled, but not gentle. The city suffered immensely, but not in the way it would have suffered under the all-consuming flames of wildfire. That fate, at least, was averted thanks to Tywin's calculated decision, but the capital paid a terrible price for its conquest, and the common people of King's Landing would not soon forget the horrors they had witnessed and endured. In the throne room, Aerys paced frantically, his madness reaching its fever pitch. He had received word that the Lannisters had breached the city walls and were now advancing toward the Red Keep. His pyromancers stood ready, their hands trembling slightly as they awaited his command. The pots of wildfire were strategically placed throughout the city, ready to ignite the entire metropolis in a green inferno. The order needed only to be given, the words uttered, and the destruction would begin. He turned to Jaime Lannister, his Kingsguard, the son of the man who had just betrayed him in the most egregious manner imaginable. He either gave the order to burn the city, unleashing the devastating wildfire, or was on the very precipice of giving it. His hand raised, his lips parted to speak the fatal command, and what happened next in those fleeting moments of history irrevocably determined whether King's Landing would exist as a city in the aftermath, or whether it would be reduced to a smoldering ruin, a testament to the madness and cruelty of a king who had lost all touch with reality. Jaime Lannister, faced with an impossible choice, made a decision that would forever define him, a decision that would both save the city and damn him in the eyes of many. Jaime Lannister killed Aerys, ending the Targaryen dynasty's long and bloody reign. He plunged his sword into the king's back, a brutal act of regicide. Then, to ensure the Mad King Aerys's demise, he slit his throat. Sir Jaime Lannister, the golden-haired prodigy of Casterly Rock who had ascended to the Kingsguard at a tender age, taking his vows before his beard had even fully sprouted, had betrayed his sacred oath. He, the protector, had become the executioner. Afterward, with a chilling calm, he seated himself upon the Iron Throne, the very symbol of the power he had just shattered. When Eddard Stark finally arrived, having ridden relentlessly from the south, pushing his men and horses beyond their limits, what he found was a scene of stark horror. Jaime Lannister was perched upon the Iron Throne, the corpse of the slain king sprawled at his feet and his golden armor stained with blood. The image was a tableau of broken vows and shattered ideals. A king's guard sworn to protect, now an usurper upon the throne presiding over the king he had murdered. Ned Stark was utterly repulsed. The weight of the broken oath pressed down on him, immediate and unacceptable. In Ned's unwavering moral code, a man who pledged his life to safeguard a king and then extinguished it was not worthy of honor or excuse. Jaime's defense that Aerys had been on the verge of unleashing wildfire and immolating the entire city, while factual, the wildfire was real, the order given or nearly so, did little to mitigate the gravity of his oath-breaking in Ned's eyes. This was the genesis of the rift between two men who had fought on the same side, bled for the same cause. Jaime had acted pragmatically, decisively. He had saved King's Landing, ended the reign of a madman, and averted a catastrophe that would have claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet he had done so by shattering his vows, a transgression compounded by the convenient timing of his father's arrival, an event that painted the Lannisters in a light of opportunism. The city was saved, the Targaryens were finished, but the question of Jaime's actions, of whether they were born of necessity or betrayal, heroism or treachery, would haunt him for the rest of his days. He became known as the Kingslayer, a title he could never entirely refute. Before Eddard Stark's arrival, before the Stark reckoning in the throne room while Lannister forces were still securing the city, a far more heinous act unfolded. Within the Red Keep, in the chambers where Princess Alia Martell had sought refuge with her children, Rhaenys, a girl barely 3 years old, and Aegon, an infant, Lannister men forced their way through the door. What ensued is one of the darkest, most morally reprehensible episodes of the rebellion's conclusion. The precise chain of command, the explicit orders issued or withheld, remain shrouded in historical ambiguity. What is undeniably clear is the outcome. The children of Rhaegar and Alia were brutally murdered. Alia herself was slain. The man most directly implicated, both by reputation, proximity, and subsequent investigation by conscientious lords, was Gregor Clegane, a knight in Lannister service, a towering figure of monstrous size and equally monstrous cruelty, whose name was synonymous with brutality throughout the Westerlands. The children were butchered, Princess Alia was murdered, and Sir Gregor Clegane walked out of those blood-soaked chambers a free man, still in the service of a lord who had just gained immeasurable political advantage from a war they had strategically delayed entering until the outcome was assured. Tywin Lannister brazenly presented the bodies, meticulously wrapped as if in reverence to Robert Baratheon upon the new king's arrival, as proof of loyalty, as a definitive statement that the Targaryen line was extinguished. Robert reportedly deemed it a good thing. Ned Stark did not. This marked another fissure, a deeper one than the first. Ned had fought the war believing in its noble cause. The removal of a mad king, the restoration of justice, the avenging of his family's murdered kin. But the slaughter of innocent children was not justice, was not the cause for which he had raised his banners. The Lannisters' method of securing Robert's victory to Ned was a stain upon everything the rebellion professed to represent. He voiced his disapproval. Robert, in his moment of triumph, refused to hear it. The initial crack between the two old friends, laid in the rubble of King's Landing before the victory was even formally celebrated, was small, yet small fractures, whether in stone or in friendship, have a tendency to spread. While King's Landing was being secured, while Robert embarked on the business of seizing a throne and selecting a queen, Eddard Stark was riding south, driven by a more urgent purpose. He had not prioritized the capital because Lyanna, his sister, wherever she might be, was his overriding concern. He had fought the entire war with this objective buried beneath the weight of command, alliance, and strategy. Every battle, every march, every decision made at the head of a northern host was tinged with the thought of Lyanna, of her captivity, of her fate. With the fighting concluded, nothing stood between him and his sister. He rode towards dawn, towards a place that would later be known as the Tower of Joy. He traveled with a small company of loyal men, 7 riders in all, according to surviving accounts, men who had stood by him throughout the rebellion, men he trusted enough to bring on an errand whose true nature he could not fully divulge, because he himself was unsure of what he would find. What he found was the Kingsguard, 3 of them in their pristine white cloaks, armed and resolute, standing before the tower's entrance. Sir Arthur Dayne of Starfall, the Sword of the Morning, arguably the most celebrated swordsman the realm had ever produced within living memory, a man whose reputation was so legendary that even other great knights spoke of him with a reverence reserved for those who transcended ordinary measurement. Sir Oswell Went was also present, alongside Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, the most senior of the 3, white-haired and as immovable as the stones of the tower itself. 3 Kingsguard, 3 of the most formidable warriors in the realm, standing guard before a tower at dawn, while their king had perished in King's Landing without their protection. The question of why they were there, why these particular knights, sworn to safeguard the king's life, had spent the war at a remote Dornish tower rather than at the king's side, is one of the enduring mysteries of the rebellion, a question that the available evidence dances around without fully answering. Rhaegar had sent them, or Aerys had placed them there, or they had chosen it themselves. The accounts diverge. What they all agree on is that when Ned arrived, the three knights made no move to yield. They offered no explanation. Their stance and their silence conveyed a clear message. Whatever lay inside the tower was under their protection and would remain so. Ned informed them that the war was over. He told them that Rhaegar was dead. Whatever internal calculations they made, it did not sway them. Perhaps they had sworn an oath that superseded the outcome of the war. Perhaps they understood that they had already committed themselves, in the deepest sense, to this post and this moment. Perhaps their inherent character simply precluded the kind of pragmatism that would have allowed them to step aside. The ensuing battle claimed the lives of most of the men Ned had brought with him. 6 of his 7 companions perished before that tower. The 3 Kingsguard also fell, a testament to something profound, though it is difficult to pinpoint precisely what. To the quality of the men involved, certainly. To the gravity with which both sides regarded the situation. Only Ned and Howland Reed survived. Ned ascended the stairs. He found Lyanna dying. She had given birth, and the process had taken its toll. She was fading but conscious. She recognized him. They had a brief respite. What she whispered to him, what she made him promise in those final moments, history does not record with the same precision as battles and treaties. The words passed between a dying girl and her surviving brother in a room at dawn. Then she was gone. And Ned descended the stairs carrying an infant and a secret. The infant was a boy. Ned named him Jon Snow of Winterfell, presented to the world as a bastard son, the result of some wartime liaison whose mother Ned refused to name. The story did not align with the man. Everyone who knew Ned Stark, even casually, found it difficult to reconcile with their understanding of his character. Catelyn, who had to endure the mystery within her own household, found it the most challenging of all. The silence Ned maintained on the subject was absolute and permanent, a silence that must have extracted a daily toll. He carried Lyanna home to Winterfell. He laid her to rest in the crypts, alongside the kings and lords of the north who had come before her. In the stories that circulated afterward, people would claim he brought something small of hers down into that darkness, some memento of the beginning, some reminder that the road to the Tower of Joy had commenced at Harrenhal, with a crown of winter roses and a silence that lingered too long. Whether that was memory or the embellishment of grief, only Ned ever knew, and Ned never elucidated any of it. He ascended the stairs. He had a kingdom to serve, a family to raise, and a lord's duties to fulfill. The grief accompanied him everywhere, and most who observed him in those years could perceive it without being able to articulate it. He was a man who had endured something unspeakable, and who had chosen to prioritize everything else above speaking of it. Whether that was strength or loss, or a combination of both that defies easy categorization, is a question each person must answer for themselves. 3 knights stood before a tower at dawn while their king burned in King's Landing. This is the stark, inescapable fact that lies at the heart of the Tower of Joy, stranger in some ways than anything else that transpired there. Sir Arthur Dayne, Sir Oswell Went, Lord Commander Gerald Hightower, 3 of the most accomplished swordsmen in the realm, wearing the white cloaks of the Kingsguard, an order whose sole sacred charge was the preservation of the king's life. And they were not in King's Landing. They were not at the Trident. They were at a tower in Dorne guarding something other than the king. Their presence there raises questions that cut to the core of what oath-keeping truly means when oaths collide. Kingsguard knights were bound by vows of absolute fidelity. They swore to protect the king above all else, above family, above personal feelings, above any other obligation. They donned the white cloak and relinquished the rest of their lives. No wife, no children, no lands or inheritance. The cloak was everything, and the king's life was the cloak's raison d'etre. It was one of the oldest and most solemn pledges in the realm's tradition. Sir Arthur Dayne had not abandoned that pledge out of cowardice or self-interest. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests the contrary. Those who faced him in the training yard or on the battlefield spoke of him with a reverence usually reserved for those who transcend ordinary measurement. He was known as the Sword of the Morning, a title held by the Knight of House Dane who wielded their ancestral blade, Dawn, a sword said to be forged from the heart of a fallen star. Men who could defeat any other knight in the realm confessed that they did not know if they could defeat Arthur Dane, and he died at the Tower of Joy. He and his two companions fell to Eddard Stark and the survivors of the small company Ned brought with him, and the accounts suggest that it cost Ned dearly, even with numerical superiority, so why were they there? The answer almost certainly lies with Rhaegar. The prince had stationed them at the tower, not the king. Aerys had no part in this arrangement, or if he did, no record of his involvement survives. Rhaegar had issued instructions to his Kingsguard, and those instructions had directed them south to Dorne while the war raged without them. This is where, if those they were he died at the tower, standing his ground, without summoning assistance or abandoning his post when the war's outcome became apparent. This is, or it is, they were, whether what Robert, he was a more he was the elder lord who had raised both Robert and Ned, who had been the first to raise his banners, who had sustained the rebellion in its early stages through the sheer force of his reputation and his steadfast judgment, assumed his position beside the new king. He would serve faithfully for years. He would eventually uncover the truth about Cersei's children, that they were not Robert's but her own twin brothers, and he would be murdered for that discovery before he could act upon it. Ned Stark went home. He returned to Winterfell. He had no inclination for the games of the capital, no desire to abandon the north that needed him. He married Catelyn Tully, his brother's intended, now his own, a marriage forged in the crucible of war, and rebuilt what his father's death and the rebellion had diminished. He did so quietly and effectively. He was a good lord. His people were safe. His family flourished. He took his responsibilities to the Night's Watch seriously at a time when few others did. He raised the bastard Jon alongside his own sons and daughters and guarded the secret of the boy's parentage with the particular ferocity of a man who understood the potential cost of the truth. Stannis Baratheon defended Storm's End throughout the protracted siege with a tenacity that became the opening chapter of his legend. He received no lavish reward for his efforts. When King's Landing fell and the war concluded, Robert granted Dragonstone, the former Targaryen seat, the island fortress in the bay, to Stannis, rather than restoring Storm's End to him outright. The logistics of the decision made a certain sense. Stannis was already familiar to the Dragonstone garrison, but the symbolism stung. Storm's End was their ancestral home. Stannis had held it for a year under siege while others fought the war's more celebrated battles, and his reward was a windswept island that reeked of salt and old dragon bones, while Renly, their younger brother who had been too young to participate in the fighting, eventually received Storm's End itself. Stannis Baratheon did not forget. He was not a man who readily forgot slights. The resentment festered slowly, as the most enduring resentments often do, not with loud pronouncements or public grievances, but in the quiet accumulation of a long accounting that he carried alongside everything else. Robert seized his throne and began the slow, agonizing process of realizing that ruling a kingdom bore little resemblance to conquering one. He possessed the Iron Throne. He had allies. He had a queen, Cersei Lannister, who brought Westerland's gold and Lannister might, but nothing resembling affection or genuine loyalty to the marriage. The small council teemed with men who knew how to navigate the corridors of power. Jon Arryn managed the day-to-day administration with the reliable competence that had made him invaluable throughout his career. The realm began to function again, but Robert himself began to decay from within. The man who had blazed across the rebellion like a wildfire found himself, in the ensuing peace, a man without sufficient fuel. He was not suited for the deliberate daily grind of governance. He was built for crisis, for the clarity of purpose that accompanied having an enemy, a direction, and a cause. Peace offered none of those things, and in their absence he sought refuge in the familiar consolations, the feast, the hunt, the brothel, with escalating desperation and dwindling capacity for shame. Lyanna haunted him. Her tomb in the crypts of Winterfell drew him back whenever he visited. He would stand in the cold, dark depths of that ancient place, grieving in a way that he could not allow himself to do in any other setting. The living woman beside him in his bed was invariably, in some part of his mind, a comparison drawn against the deceased girl he had loved and lost. Cersei understood this as with the particular cold and precise clarity that characterized her understanding of most things. It did not endear him to her. It made her more ruthlessly self-serving, which from her perspective may have amounted to the same thing. And in the sun-drenched lands of Essos, far from the ruins of King's Landing, a woman named Rhaella Targaryen died in childbirth on Dragonstone. She had been sent there before the city fell, carrying the last embers of the dynasty within her womb. The child she bore was a daughter. The daughter would be named Daenerys. Then a storm swept through, scattering the Targaryen fleet. A young man, Viserys, Aerys' surviving son, seized his infant sister and fled across the narrow sea. They crossed with nothing but their name, and whatever retainers could not bear to abandon the last vestiges of their line. They would wander the free cities for years, diminished, dependent, moving from one borrowed hall to the next. As former allies grew weary of the obligation and the welcome wore thin, Viserys carried the crown in his head, as exiles invariably do, with an intensity that grew more brittle and more desperate the longer the exile lasted. The dragons his house had once ridden were gone. The claim endured, but the claim would not hatch into anything tangible for a very long time. There is a temptation, when reflecting on Robert's rebellion, to perceive it as a straightforward narrative with a clean resolution. The Mad King was overthrown, justice was served, the realm was spared the full extent of Aerys' madness. A new dynasty ascended to the throne, promising stability, but the victory was not clean. It never had been. The deeds committed to achieve it, the murders in the Red Keep's chambers, the looting and fires that marred the sack, the manner of the Mad King's demise, were not abstract concepts. They were concrete actions carried out by specific individuals, and they left behind specific grievances in their wake. The Martells of Dorne remembered. They would remember for a very long time, quietly and precisely, in the manner of a people who understood that time is not always an enemy of justice. They had sent their princess to the Red Keep as a bride, and she had returned in pieces, and the man who sat upon the Iron Throne had accepted that offering without punishment and deemed it a propitious beginning. The wound in Sunspear would not heal while those men still drew breath. Rhaegar's children were dead. The prince who had ignited everything by placing a crown of roses in the wrong woman's lap had fallen at the Trident. His wife had been murdered in her own chambers. His daughter and infant son had been slain before they were old enough to grasp the meaning of a crown or why it could cost a life. The Targaryen line was not entirely extinguished. Viserys and the infant Daenerys had crossed the narrow sea, but the branch of House Targaryen that had blossomed with such arrogant splendor at Harrenhal, only to be brutally severed at the Trident, left behind no living legitimate heirs to claim the Iron Throne. The dragon's fire seemed extinguished, save for embers flickering across the narrow sea. The lords who had flocked to Robert's banner, united by a common enemy and the intoxicating promise of victory, were never a truly unified force. They were a coalition of self-interests, bound together for the duration of the war, now returning to their own carefully laid plans and long-simmering ambitions. The camaraderie forged in the heat of battle, the alliances sworn in blood, these were genuine, yes, but the true test of such bonds lay not in war but in the subtle, often treacherous currents of peacetime. Almost immediately the Game of Thrones resumed, with its intricate web of debts and resentments. Old obligations were scrutinized and recalculated, often with a cynical eye. New grievances, born of perceived slights and unmet expectations, festered beneath the surface. Reach lords, who had spent much of the war languishing under the banners of siege outside Storm's End, their ambition curtailed, now joined the new order with carefully calibrated smiles and the practiced diplomacy of men who had backed the losing side and desperately needed to be seen as something other than defeated. The rebellion had indeed produced a king, a powerful warrior celebrated in song and story, but it had singularly failed to create the stable conditions necessary for good governance. Robert was a magnificent warrior, a man who could inspire armies and cleave skulls with his legendary warhammer. He knew how to fight, how to endure hardship, how to lead men into the very jaws of death. But he possessed little patience for the tedious, unglamorous work of ruling. He did not know how to be still, how to listen, how to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, the endless trade negotiations, The long-running disputes between noble houses that required attentive, sustained attention to resolve fairly, these were tasks that bored and frustrated him. He delegated that crucial work to Jon Arryn, his hand, a man of unwavering loyalty and sharp intellect, and the arrangement worked, more or less, as long as Jon Arryn lived, his wisdom and tireless efforts holding the fragile kingdom together. But the foundation was inherently unstable, its strength dependent entirely on the health and capabilities of one aging man, carrying a burden that should have been distributed far more broadly across the realm. The new kingdom, for all its outward appearance of strength and stability, lacked any real depth of governance. It had a king who was increasingly detached and disinterested, a hand who valiantly compensated for his king's failings, and a council of powerful men, each serving their own interests beneath a thin, easily pierced veneer of collective purpose. Ned Stark, Warden of the North, understood this perhaps better than any man in the Seven Kingdoms. He had witnessed the true cost of victory, the rivers of blood and the mountains of corpses. He had seen the darkness that lurked within even the noblest of causes. He carried the grief and disillusionment of the war back north with him, burdened by the unanswered questions that gnawed at his conscience. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the edifice they had so painstakingly constructed was fragile, teetering on the brink of collapse. He knew that the hands now grasping for power were not always steady, nor always clean. He had looked upon the Iron Throne as a young man, fresh from the horrors of war, and seen not the glorious symbol of power and authority that others so eagerly coveted, but a monstrous thing of accumulated blades, a weapon that cut the person sitting upon it as surely as it cut all those who dared to defy them. He was right, more right than he could possibly have articulated at the time, and it was a truth for which he would eventually pay the ultimate price. The foundations of Robert's reign, the hasty arrangements made in the rubble and euphoria of victory, the debts traded for allegiance, the convenient silences maintained to avoid further bloodshed, these would take 15 long years to fully crack, to splinter and crumble under the weight of their own inherent flaws, but crack they would. Everything that came later, the War of the Five Kings, the shattered houses, the scattered children of the great families, all grew from the poisonous seeds planted in the rebellion's bloody aftermath, the insidious Lannister influence that wormed its way into the very heart of the royal household. The simmering Martell grievance, carefully nurtured and waiting for its moment in the shadows of Dorne. The Baratheon brothers, divided by bitter resentment and unchecked ambition, and the bastard in Winterfell, the silent, brooding Jon Snow, whose true parentage, if ever revealed, would shatter the entire question of succession and plunge the realm into yet another bloody conflict. Power changes hands, as it always does, but the damage inflicted in the process of that change, the compromises made, the moral compromises sacrificed, do not simply disappear, they linger, festering like a wound left untended. They work their way into the very fabric of society, into the walls of castles and the hearts of men. It becomes the damp in the stone that no one notices, the subtle rot that slowly weakens the structure until one day the entire edifice begins to crumble. The tournament at Harrenhal, with its pageantry and its petty intrigues, is where most histories choose to begin this tragic tale. But that is a superficial understanding, a focus on the symptom rather than the underlying disease. The tournament is merely the visible manifestation of a deeper malaise, the crown of roses hiding a multitude of thorns, the public slight that masks a web of long-standing grievances. It is the incident that can be neatly pointed to and precisely dated, but it is not the true beginning. The real beginning is far more elusive, harder to pinpoint with any degree of certainty. Lies somewhere in the slow, insidious accumulation of years under a king whose own mind was gradually becoming his worst enemy, consumed by paranoia and prone to fits of uncontrollable rage. It is in the growing distance that opened between Aerys and the lords who had once served him with unwavering loyalty, the steady erosion of trust, not in single dramatic ruptures, but in the relentless wearing down of small disappointments and petty betrayals. What the rebellion ultimately reveals, for those who are willing to sit with it long enough to truly understand its complexities, is how much the stability and order of a realm depends not on its laws or its traditions or its ancient oaths, but on the quality of the people at its very center, the men and women who wield power and influence. The compact between lord and king is, at its core, an agreement about restraint, a mutual understanding of the limitations of power. The king does not abuse his authority, does not become a tyrant. The lords do not act solely on their private grievances, do not succumb to petty jealousies and personal ambitions. Both sides hold themselves to something larger than their immediate advantage, to the good of the realm as a whole. But when one side stops holding, when that implicit contract is broken, the other will eventually follow, succumbing to the same temptations and abandoning the same principles. Aerys Targaryen stopped holding, not all at once, but gradually, insidiously. With each man he burned alive, with each promise he broke, with each paranoid accusation he elevated to the force of law, he tested the limits of what the realm would endure, pushing the boundaries of obedience to the breaking point, and the realm endured more than it should have. Out of habit, out of tradition, out of a lingering sense of loyalty, and out of the faint but persistent hope that things might somehow improve, that the king might somehow return to his senses. But there is a point beyond which endurance becomes complicity, a point where silence becomes betrayal. And Rickard Stark's agonizing death in that throne room, with his son Brandon slowly strangling beside him, was the point past which no man of honor, no man of conscience could stand still and do nothing. Rhaegar Targaryen's actions, his impulsive abduction of Lyanna Stark, sparked the rebellion, ignited the tinderbox of discontent that had been smoldering for years. But it was Aerys Targaryen's madness, his descent into cruelty and paranoia, that made the rebellion inevitable, that turned simmering resentment into open revolt. Robert Baratheon won the war with a thunderous blow from his warhammer and a grief that would never find its resolution, a wound that would fester until the day he died. Ned Stark endured it, carrying a secret to the grave, a burden of knowledge that shaped his every action and haunted his every dream. Jaime Lannister survived it, branded with a name, Kingslayer, that was simultaneously the worst thing he had ever been called and the most accurate description of his act. And Lyanna Stark died in a tower in Dorne, her brother Ned beside her, whatever truth she knew dissolving into the quiet and the cold stone, leaving behind the long, unanswerable question of what she had chosen and what had been chosen for her. The fire of rebellion that remade the world, that cleansed the land of the Targaryen dynasty, did not burn itself clean. Fires rarely do. They leave behind ash and soot and the charred remains of what once was. They leave behind the things that were buried in the ash, the secrets and lies and unspoken truths that will continue to haunt the land for generations to come. And they leave behind the people who must live on that land, who must rebuild and try to create something new from the ruins, Westeros rebuilt, as Westeros always does. The question that the rebellion leaves behind, the question that continues to echo through the halls of power and the hovels of the poor, is not whether the right men won. It is whether winning is ever truly clean, whether any victory can be achieved without sacrificing something of value, without leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered lives. When the very method of winning has already determined what comes next, when the means justify the ends, then the seeds of future conflict are inevitably sown. The Lannisters entered King's Landing through opened gates, but their ruthlessness and ambition would soon turn those gates into walls, dividing them from the rest of the realm. The Targaryens died not only on the battlefield but in nurseries, their blood spilled by those who claimed to be bringing peace and justice. The new king married a woman whose loyalty was always to her family first, to her husband and her kingdom second. The most honorable man in the rebellion went home to the north, retreating behind the ancient walls of Winterfell, and spent the next 15 years trying to keep the world at arm's length, shielding his family from the corruption and intrigue that he knew lurked in the south. None of it held. Somewhere in the rubble of King's Landing, beneath the ash of Aerys's shattered ambitions, the next war was already being built, stone by stone, lie by lie, quietly, without ceremony, in the darkness where secrets fester and resentments grow. The way all the worst things are built, slowly, deliberately, one stone at a time, and the roses, the beautiful, fragrant roses that had once symbolized love and hope, were still out there somewhere, scattered in a river, left to wither in a dead woman's crypt, a poignant reminder of what had been lost. The realm had moved on, as realms always move on, adapting and evolving to meet the challenges of a new era. But some things that seem to end do not end at all. They simply go quiet, lying dormant beneath the surface. They wait, patient and unforgiving, in the stone and the cold and the long dark, until the season turns again, and what was buried becomes once more impossible to ignore, rising from the ashes to haunt the present and shape the future. And so the rebellion ended, but the story did not. Mad King burned, a prince fell in a river of rubies, a city was saved by a broken oath, and in a quiet tower at dawn, a promise was made that would echo through generations. Robert won his throne, but victory came stained with ash and blood. The dragons were gone, yet their shadow lingered. The war was over, yet its consequences had only begun. Perhaps that is the true lesson of Robert's rebellion. No victory is ever clean, no crown is ever won without cost, and sometimes the seeds of the next war are planted the very moment the last one ends. So now I ask you, what do you think truly ended the Targaryen dynasty? Madness, prophecy, or ambition? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this journey into Westeros meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to Scottish Sleep Stories for more immersive tales of history, legend, and the quiet moments that shape the world. Till